Fortunately, I stumbled across a magazine that featured women with large buttocks.
And by stumble across, you mean removed from your sock drawer and brought with you.
This is the Big Bang Theory. You've never seen it, you can't stream it anywhere, but it exists. And it's very, very weird. But more importantly, it's very bad. I've looked at a few unaired pilots for this channel, and this is an entirely different show. And it doesn't work at all, to the point where even after enjoying parts of the pilot, a network required an entire rework of the show pitch. But what this also is an interesting lesson in the realities of traditional TV and how to identify what's wrong with something before it becomes a much bigger issue. So this is a look at what happens when pilots go bad, on why the original version of Penny was fired and replaced, and how one of television's most iconic characters was originally kind of a mess. What you're about to see is a version of The Big Bang that was passed on by every network it was taken to during the 06 pilot season. Oh, and the pilot's a black mark for the network and can only be found in standard def, so that's what you're getting here.
He's just acting on his evolutionary imperative to protect a fertile female in jeopardy.
Oh good, I was afraid it might be something creepy.
This is the original version of Penny in The Big Bang Theory. She is borderline unwatchable in this pilot. The high-level structure here is kind of the same. The guy started the DNA bank, then young woman is alone, meets two nerdy guys, and moves into the building.
What's his problem?
This isn't where we normally sit. We sit at that table over there. That's our table.
Hey, I cannot impose on you guys.
Thank you.
So right up front, we'll just say it's for 3 days. A week tops.
Except here, she comes to stay in the guy's apartment, and the problems start from there. For starters, Katie, who would obviously be turned into Penny in the final show, is just plain mean. In fact, in audience testing, creator Chuck Lorre would later say that the biggest feedback was that audience members wished, and I quote, that the mean lady would stay away from the sweet boys. This version of Penny doesn't care about the guys. She's manipulative, angry, and frankly, unenjoyable to watch. It doesn't help that Amanda Walsh, the actress playing Katie, who is quite good, has absolutely no chemistry with Jim Parsons and Johnny Galecki.
You're asking me to dinner?
Yes.
Why?
And that's a problem when you're going to have your character, who in this pilot, spends a bunch of time making fun of the guys for their inexperience with women. In fact, Penny's presence here plays more like a screen test than a pilot. It doesn't work. Lesson here in casting. You hear about chemistry a lot in film and TV, and probably have a hard time identifying when it works. And that's because it's working. There is chemistry. When you cast actors who don't play well off of each other, especially in sitcoms, however, the timing becomes an issue. Jokes don't land, emotions don't come across, and the easiest way to spot this is actually to watch movies like Alvin and the Chipmunks or Hop, or even Transformers. Watch how detached the actors seem from their CG counterparts, or how much they have to overact to make up for the fact that there's usually nothing but rubber balls in front of them on set, and they're not playing off of anything, and so a lot of things are either flat or incredibly overacted, but mostly flat. If you get the same feeling from characters on a sitcom, that's how you know there's a chemistry issue in casting. When it feels like they could be engaging with rubber balls. When it feels like there isn't a human in front of them. And that's present here. Penny isn't charming or funny, she almost plays like a villain. But she's not the only character that feels off.
We were in costume, of course. He was doing such an effective job of portraying a Vulcan caught up in the pond farm mating fever, I couldn't say no.
Where things really take a turn for this pilot is in just how dramatically they had to change Sheldon Cooper after it. This is a perfect depiction of misunderstanding character. In the original pilot, Sheldon was a mess of ideas, some of which were diametrically opposed to one another. Inconsistency in character. Here, Sheldon is actually kind of a dog. For example, at that donation bank, he says that a magazine with a big behind on it helped him complete his process, and then argues about how totally normal that is. Another character, we'll talk about in a second, talks in the episode about how her and Sheldon's nighttime encounter a while back was filled with roleplay. And when he sees vulnerable Katie on the street, he cares nothing for her, just like the final version of Sheldon. But instead of continuing that indifference, this Sheldon appears to show some physical interest in her? Yeah, that's right, the original version of Big Bang has a Sheldon Cooper that was stifled but much more advanced in one specific department, to the point where Sheldon and Leonard would have been vying potentially for Penny's, and a character we'll get to in a second, romantic attention simultaneously. Why doesn't this work? Well, when you pit two main characters against each other for the affection of a third main character, not only is your conflict too obvious, but once it's resolved once, You split the audience with that decision. Team X or Team X. More importantly here, Sheldon isn't written particularly well. They try to combine social confusion with that kind of physical intent that's only played for comedy, and so you get something that plays, well, like there's just two versions of Leonard. Good cop, bad cop. And written as he is here, when you overtly and immediately give Sheldon physical desire, he plays like a physically frustrated outcast, instead of a guy that simply struggles with communication and human connection. But let's get to that character I keep mentioning.
Let's put our cards on the table, shall we? Right now, Leonard and I are doing research together. It's casual, professional. A couple of months from now, there'll be a transition. Hey, how about a cup of coffee?
There are no Howard and Raj here. The original version of Big Bang didn't have a Howard and Raj. They were created in response to Gilda, this woman right here. You might notice a similarity to someone else once again, but we'll get there. Gilda was the pilot's response to Katie, or original Penny. She was her exact opposite, a take no prisoners, cutest for kids style character that was meant to act as a competing romantic interest for the Leonard and Sheldon of the show. So instead of a group of 5 friends hanging out in an apartment, like the final show would become, a tried and true sitcom trope by the way, what you had was 2 stifled and nerdy 20-somethings competing for the attention of 2 more dominant women. Gilda was an uncomfortable presence in the pilot. She confused a simple storyline, but she's also dry, uninteresting, and a burden to the pace. Both her and Penny are not well-written characters. This 2-guy, 2-girl sitcom style could have only ended one way, but by removing Gilda, keeping and reworking Penny, and adding 2 more guys, they solved that problem. So who is Gilda anyway?
Here because my mother and I have agreed that I will date at least once a year.
Interesting. My mother and I have the same agreement about church.
Well, let's talk about what from this pilot actually ended up making it back in the show, or at least the final pilot. Penny's abandoned and alone storyline obviously would make for the same plot as the final pilot, so would the guys going and starting their day with the donation. Gilda would 3 full seasons into the show later become the template for Amy Farrah Fowler. They're essentially the same character down to their wardrobe and hairstyle. Oh, and the original theme song. Yep, Blinded by Science. So I guess that would change, but hey, still a science-friendly song. Look, The Big Bang Theory is obviously a polarizing show and topic on the internet, but regardless of its quality, it's hard not to appreciate what Chuck Lorre and team accomplished here. They took a risk. They made their own pilot for a show outside of the studio system using their own money, and it was bad. It failed. But instead of being defiant and saying, they just don't get the genius of my thing, or we're just not talking to the right people, if we find them, they'll understand our show, they swallowed their pride, took the feedback, went back to the drawing board, and turned one of television's worst failed pilots into one of the most successful sitcoms in TV history. Whether The Big Bang is for you or not, it is one of the finest examples of course correction in the industry. So if you think your thing sucks, if you're being told that a problem might exist in your work, your writing, your art, take another look at it. The feedback could be wrong, it could be misplaced, but you, the artist, will always be the last person to know for sure. But it's always better to be the last person to find the problem than it is to never find it at all.
Mark Brandanowitz.
Mark here was originally supposed to be, well, basically the Jim Halpert of Pawnee, Indiana.
What is your name, sir? I am Bill Buttlicker. Really, that's your real name?
During his 30-episode run on Parks and Rec, his character was set up as sort of this wounded and reformed philanderer who was the foil to the character of Leslie Knope. I was romantically connected to both her and the character of Ann Perkins. As the show progressed, his character seemed to have fewer and fewer things to do. After his fall into the pit, he seemed to emerge as a completely different character entirely and no longer seemed to fit into the world of Parks and Rec. Over the course of the second season, Mark's character was reduced to about 2 or 3 lines per episode.
$1,000.
And it was clear that the character was getting phased out. Well, phased out is actually an understatement. Mark gets erased. His final appearance at the end of season 2 is the last time his character is even mentioned. It's like he entered the witness protection program or something. Even the scene in the season 5 episode titled Halloween Surprise, where Anne is showing off her boyfriend boxes, Mark's name is nowhere to be found. So what happened here? Why was Mark fired from Parks and Rec? This is a story of how and why Mark's character was set up to fail from the very beginning. To really understand the situation, we'll need to look back to the show that inspired Parks and Rec in the first place, The Office. By the time Parks and and Rec's first season aired, The Office was approaching the tail end of its 5th season and was garnering about 7 to 8 million viewers per episode. Parks and Rec creators Greg Daniels and Michael Schur used The Office as a roadmap for success and applied the same techniques they used in creating, well, The Office directly within and to create their new show. Now, if you remember the first season of The Office, the show was built around the tension and mild animosity between the characters. That was its substance. Well, season 1 of Parks and Rec isn't that much different than that. There's a pre-existing tension and almost negative energy between the show's characters, and it's in this environment where the character of Mark actually thrives. Mark is a voice of reason in the otherwise chaotic offices of the city of Pawnee, Indiana, and effectively serves as a grounding tool for some of the show's major players. He has pre-existing sexual connections with Leslie Knope and romantic interest in Ann Perkins, which serves as almost like a love triangle, building tension between the characters throughout episodes that normally would exist with maybe a singular focus in these romantic interests. His character is also capable of getting some of the more steadfast characters, like Ron Swanson, to be a little more flexible in their ways. Mark also facilitates the progression of a lot of major plot points that drive the entirety of the first season. However, the necessity for his character slowly dissipates as the show progresses. More concrete relationships are formed within the supporting cast, and characters are finding new and interesting ways to work together episode to episode without the help of Mark. We, as an audience, begin to actively dislike Mark due to some of the ways he goes about solving what we'd call problems. He sort of exists in a gray area in between a romantic lead and this kind of sleazebag, anti-hero almost. This is an area where the character of Jim Halpert succeeds and Mark fails. Jim is never seen slaving around or drunkenly hitting on women. As viewers, we trust Jim throughout the first couple seasons. Mark, on the other hand, is deeply flawed to an almost problematic degree. We just aren't really rooting for the guy, and it's hard to build a romantic lead around a character like that. He never does anything great enough to be rooted for, and he never does anything terrible enough to warrant a redemption arc. By the time season 2 rolls around, there isn't a whole lot for Mark to do. In fact, he's been written into this very middling box where his existence is simply unnecessary in some ways. He's just this sort of bland everyman in a group of extremely distinct and quirky characters. In fact, Paul Schneider has gone on record as saying his confusion over the character during this time, stating that even he himself was confused over the lack of things for his character to do, made it hard for him to, well, act. Not to mention that the romantic focus of the show was slowly drifting away from Mark and Ann and gravitating toward the burgeoning relationship between Andy and April, which brings us to the second catalyst in the downfall of this character, Andy Dwyer. When we first meet Andy, he's arguably the most reprehensible character on the show. He's a shiftless and irresponsible man-child who makes Mark seem like a real catch by comparison. Andy was initially intended to be a one-and-done character after his breakup with Ann, meaning one arc and out, but the writers and crew enjoyed having Chris Pratt on set so much, and the character was such a hit with home viewing audiences that they ended up finding a way to keep the character on the show. Eventually, Andy and April begin their romance. It's portrayed in such an honest, innocent way that you can't help but fall in love with these characters and that arc, and things for the show shift. The on-scene chemistry continues to grow between Chris Pratt and Aubrey Plaza, and it effectively drowns out the relationship between Ann and Mark. So now we have this character in Mark who is no longer bringing anything to the table romantically either. He isn't really making an impact with his relationships and isn't really adding to the narrative and the plot in any way at this point as well.
Apparently tonight I'm the Parks Department's 7th wheel.
The second season additions of both Adam Scott's character, Ben Wyatt, and Rob Lowe's character all but signal the death knell for Mark, as they are much stronger characters with much clearer motives and much more concise writing. They also end up being much better romantic leads as well. Chris and Ann have a much healthier and more interesting connection than Ann and Mark, and this is largely in part to the much needed optimism that Chris injects to the show.
Diet, exercise, supplements, positive thinking. Scientists believe that the first human being who will live 150 years has already been born. I believe I am that human being.
But also Ben Wyatt and Leslie Knope make a great pair, and the relationship ends up being the linchpin of the entire show moving forward after this point. Heck, even Ron Swanson's relationship with Tammy is more interesting than any relationship Mark could ever have been involved in due to the way he was written. By the end of season 2, he had essentially become the blockbuster video of Parks and Rec characters. There was a time in which we loved him, but more interesting options had rendered him all but obsolete. What's weird though is behind the scenes things appeared to be amicable. Schneider understood that his character had really nowhere to go, and showrunners stated that his character would likely return to the show from time to time, and well, that was wrong as well. After Mark's lackluster send-off at the end of season 2, the character was nullified to the point of almost non-existence. In fact, the only thing that proves he was ever even on the show is a dumb painting he made. It sits in Ron Swanson's office until season 6, and then after that, Mark disappears completely. Mark's disappearance from the show almost feels both intentional and personal, despite publicly stating otherwise. In 2010, Mike Schur stated in an interview with the LA Times that the goal was to get Mark back on the show as soon as his schedule permitted, and as soon as the arcs they were writing called for it, but that day never came. In an interview with Screen Crush, Paul Schneider revealed that not only did he not have any interest in returning, but that he was never contacted about returning. I guess some things are left to never add up. Firing of Mark is a lesson in character development, but how changes in casting and storytelling that are seemingly unrelated to characters can have a massive effect on how they grow as well, and also how they can ultimately lead to characters just sort of sitting around and taking up space and time from the viewer. It isn't just enough to create characters to be one-dimensional romantic leads. We actively need to challenge the characters and in the process remind the audience that their feelings for them need to be challenged as well. That's what keeps a character interesting, and in the case of Mark, he just wasn't challenging enough. His removal from the show was absolutely necessary, as he was adding a lot of dead weight to storylines that ended up growing and flourishing in his absence. And while some fans were sad to see him go, it was the right decision for Parks and Rec. And sometimes the right decision for your art or your creative process in general. Sometimes, if something isn't working, it's best to let the mark of your process walk right on out the door.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
Hello.
It's Rhodes.
Sorry, hello?
I said it's Rhodes.
Speak up, please.
This is Rhodey, aka War Machine.
Next time, baby.
I'm only gonna say this once.
Get out.
This is Rhodey, aka War Machine. The former is played by actor and Academy Award nominee Terrence Howard. The latter is played by actor and Academy Award nominee Don Cheadle for the remainder of the MCU's run. You're probably not all that confused because you probably know that this switch was made.
Look, it's me. I'm here to deal with it.
Terrence Howard was quickly replaced after the first Iron Man film, but you might not know why. There's a big happy family fallacy within these big franchises that consistently gets torn down and torn apart by the media when you realize what's going on underneath. Acting in major motion pictures is a profession in which multi-million-dollar contracts are commonplace, and with that kind of money moving around, friendly may not be the best word to describe what's actually happening behind the scenes. Tricky contractual language can often give studios complete control over what they pay their actors, and leverage becomes a quintessential element in that process. Money over relationships. Terrence Howard was heading into production on Iron Man fresh off of an Academy Award nomination for Hustle and Flow. When an actor is nominated for an Oscar, their value to a project increases dramatically, and in turn, so usually does their pay rate. This is part of the reason actors want to win these awards, or at least be in the conversation. It's usually not the main reason. Let's be honest, they want to be great actors, they're artists. Sure, there's a lot of prestige in winning the highest award an actor can possibly win, but having the title of Oscar winner on a resume means that they can also charge more for their performances. By the time Iron Man was rolling into production, Terrence Howard's rate was set around $3.5 to $4.5 million for that performance. This made him one of the highest paid actors in the film, and at that time, the highest paid actor in the film. He was actually paid over 6 times more than Robert Downey Jr., who people forget was kind of making a return to film in a big way. His life, his trials, his career is a whole different story. Now, one of the most famous men in the world was at one time kind of a has-been. He only made about $500,000 for his role in the first film, in pure studio on-set money. Iron Man went on to be an enormous success. It received overwhelming praise from critics and fans alike, and it ultimately led to the creation of the largest and most successful cinematic universe of all time. When a project like Iron Man is successful enough to create a franchise, it's usually great for everyone involved. The directors and producers get bigger budgets for the sequels, and the actors usually get a nice pay raise, especially when that film grosses over $300 million like the original Iron Man did. Normally, something like that would mean enormous contracts getting signed, and the principal performers holding the pen on the other side of them. Robert Downey Jr. was rumored to have made $10 million for the second film, a pay increase of about 2,000%. Not to mention he was able to negotiate a back-end deal for even more money based on the revenue of the film at the box office. Terrence Howard, on the other hand, was actually offered a significant decrease in pay from what he was expecting to earn.
I'm jealous.
Next time.
Marvel eventually offered only $1 million to come back as War Machine, which was far less than the alleged $8 million he was supposed to have made for the sequel based on conversations with his agent and the studio. It was even less than what he made for the first film. So here's where things start to get a little messy and a little muddy. It's rumored that Iron Man director Jon Favreau was ultimately unhappy with Terrence Howard's performance and spent a lot of time cutting down his scenes in post. This isn't great from both an artistic perspective and more pertinently here a financial perspective, being that if a studio is going to pay premium dollars for a specific actor based on essentially their name, they're expecting that actor to have a relatively large presence in the film, to be able to use them for marketing moving forward. When producers, directors, and editors cut down that screen time, it makes the value proposition of those contracts seem a little less responsible. Allegedly, Jon Favreau was so dissatisfied with Terrence Howard's performance that he and Iron Man 2 writer Justin Theroux ended up scaling down Rhodey's role in the second film altogether under the assumption that Howard would be James Rhodes once again. Once Marvel Studios found out the War Machine's role was going to be featured in a diminished capacity, they came to Terrence Howard's agents with a counteroffer to his $8 million contract to be more in line with what they were expecting to pay a supporting actor at the time, that $1 million number. Now, an agent's job is to protect the financial interest of their client. What likely ended up happening behind the scenes, and this is where pure conjecture starts, is that his agent and publicist would want to not only ensure that their client was paid in a way that was commensurate with the rest of the leading cast, but to make sure that Terrence Howard's future roles would be measured against a larger contract, not diminish his potential for financial returns in the future on the next film or the film after that. After the dust settled, Terrence Howard had essentially walked away from the role due to this financial dispute, and was ultimately replaced with Don Cheadle, who happily signed on to play War Machine in Iron Man 2 for that $1 million.
I think I'll take it.
Which one?
All of it.
Since then, it's rumored that Don Cheadle has amassed a combined total of around $40 million in earnings across his work at the MCU. The role also landed him an Emmy nomination for his performance in The Falcon and Winter Soldier. In a 2010 interview with E! Online, Howard publicly claimed that he was the one who recommended RDJ for the role of Iron Man, but that he ultimately was happy with the way things turned out. In the interview, he almost takes sole credit for Robert Downey Jr.'s success by saying, "For me to have recommended him, it means all the more so that I helped someone get to where they are supposed to go." Jon Favreau stated that at one time Marvel said to him, "Under no circumstances are we prepared to hire Robert Downey Jr. for any price." So maybe there's something to that, but we'll never really know. Howard would get a little more upset as time went on. Over the next couple of years, you can almost link Howard's frustrations directly to the success of Marvel films. The more successful those films became, the more Howard lashed out against Marvel to the media.
Is there any chance you come back and do an Avenger movie?
With 2013, Avengers had made $1.5 billion at the box office. And at this time, Howard took to the media once more and was a little more candid. In a 2013 interview with Hollywood.com, Terrence Howard teased that the worst thing he had ever witnessed in Hollywood
was Iron Man killing my career.
In another interview with Vulture.com, Howard took the drama even further by saying that Robert Downey Jr. took the money that was supposed to go to him and pushed him out of the sequel. The reality of all of this drama is likely much more simple than any of this paints it out to be. Terrence Howard was being let go from a project for delivering a subpar performance and not wanting to take the ego hit of having a potentially future subpar performance cut down by the studio. Robert Downey Jr. kept quiet about all of this because he didn't want to ruin his opportunity that was almost denied to him because of his previous struggles with addiction and drugs. This was a once-in-a-lifetime shot at redemption for him. At the end of the day, the studio's job is to create the most profitable film possible. These films operate on stringent budgets, and in the case of Terrence Howard, Marvel didn't have him in theirs. If they continued with him, they'd be paying a lot for a character who had a significantly less impactful role in the overall story of the MCU. Replacing him was nothing more than a business decision that saved the studio tens of millions of dollars. Now, whether or not this business deal was conducted in an ethical manner will always be up for debate, but we're not here to gossip. At the end of the day, what you see on screen are people doing a job. As much as they're artists, they're also employees of the studio once they sign those contracts. What does this say about Marvel films in general? That a replacement like this was so easy for them? Does something like this create the perception that money becomes more valuable than performance? I'm not sure, because I'm not entirely sure what Jon Favreau saw in Terrence Howard's performance that made him and the studio say, this isn't working. I guess what's important to remember is that not everything in art is fixable, and that sometimes it's easier and maybe better to just move on.
So you have come here for information? I have some for you. You are all going to die.
This might seem like a normal sequence from one of the highest grossing, most acclaimed fantasy epics of all time, but it's actually the reason for a rift between two of the film industry's most beloved professionals, Peter Jackson and Christopher Lee. One, a once-in-a-generation director with a long and very storied career. The other is one of the most iconic and celebrated actors ever. See, Jackson got to start making low-budget, avant-garde genre picks. Eventually, he would work his way up to the pinnacle of Hollywood filmmaking, while Lee, well, you might recognize him for his turns as either the immortal vampire Dracula or the Sith Lord in disguise, Count Dooku. However, film fans of a certain generation will undoubtedly pinpoint him as the dastardly white wizard Saruman in the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit trilogies. Despite being a well-known actor by multiple era of film watchers, Christopher Lee, the man, was a very private individual, better known as Sir Christopher Frank Carradine Lee. So what happened here with Lord of the Rings, well, might surprise some people. See, Lee the person served in various military capacities, both the Finnish army and the English Air Force prior to his career as a performer. In fact, he didn't even begin pursuing acting until he was about 40 years old. So what Lee did not anticipate, given not really being raised in the industry, is the gray areas of artistic collaboration. When making a movie, thousands of choices have to be made. Some as small as what color a character's jacket should be, others as large as whether a famous actor makes the final cut of a film, which is exactly what happened between Lee and Peter Jackson during the filming of Lord of the Rings. Christopher Lee was cast to play the iconic villain Saruman in the Lord of the Rings films. During the filming of the first two films, Lee and Jackson became quite close, according to, well, everyone around them. However, after the completion of The Two Towers, the filmmaking pair had a nasty falling out. Lee was incensed by what Jackson had done with his character in the climax of The Two Towers.
You were very cold about it.
I wasn't cold about it.
The 7-minute sequence was filmed in which Lee's character is ultimately defeated by the Fellowship and plunges to his death, becoming impaled on a spike of a dilapidated windmill. Despite the best of intentions from Jackson, running time for the sequence was deemed too long, which is ironic given the running time of the film. The sequence functions as a sneaky homage to one of the many deaths Lee's Dracula character suffered in his Hammer horror franchise 7-film run. This scene literally shows the death of the Fellowship's ultimate enemy. By the time the film saw theatrical release, however, this sequence was removed from that cut. At the time, Jackson said his intention was to have his reveal be the opening sequence of the next film in the series, The Return of the King. That was the explanation for the chopping of that scene on the cutting room floor. Jackson told Ain't It Cool News in 2003, the problem is the sequence was originally shot for The Two Towers, as it is in the book. Since The Two Towers couldn't sustain a 7-minute wrap-up after Helm's Deep, we thought it would be a good idea to save it for the beginning of Return of the King. Trouble is, when we reviewed various Return of the King cuts over the last few weeks, it felt like the first scene wrapping up last year's movie instead of starting a new one. We felt it got Return of the King off to an uncertain beginning since Saruman plays no role in the events. We don't have the Shire like the book does, yet we dwell in Isengard for quite a long time before the story kicked off. Well, Christopher Lee didn't like that, and this reasoning did not comfort him at all.
I can't do it, Peter. I'm sorry.
From Lee's perspective, this was a massive betrayal. Was it within Jackson's contractual rights to do this? Of course. But Lee was decidedly unhappy with how this omission affected the finished film. He initially didn't like the idea of the climax of his character's arc being featured in the beginning of another film, but then became accustomed to the idea. However, upon hearing that his Saruman scene had been cut from Return of the King as well, he got a little more upset.
You have elected the way of pain!
He felt The Two Towers lacked an ending, and that with Saruman's death being taken out of Return of the King, his character was sent off without the respect he deserved, both personally, artistically, and fictionally. We were shown the films in private, and when the third film came on, I couldn't believe what I saw
because I wasn't in it.
Christopher Lee told the University of College Dublin in 2011. The show Saruman, the Fellowship's great mortal enemy, as the most evil of villains, on top of the tower, saying, well, very nasty things to them, to Aragorn.
This exile crept from the shadows will never be crowned king.
The final confrontation between the Fellowship and that greatest enemy.
It wasn't in the film.
No one could understand it. There were millions of hits on the internet. They all said the same thing. What happened to Saruman? Buy the extended DVD. Well, that was ultimately the solution that Jackson and company had landed on. They realized they could utilize the footage of Saruman and his final confrontation for an extended edition DVD product that would make a bunch of money. This solution angered Christopher Lee even more.
Here we go.
He felt that this was choosing commerce over artistic integrity. He felt that this decision was motivated solely by the potential for financial windfall, as opposed to what the story and fiction required. Now, it's worth pointing out that for the most part, these decisions are actually made by studios, not Peter Jackson. Regardless, this is one of the most difficult aspects of producing work collaboratively. A director has to balance not only what is best for the movie, but the various egos and personalities around the people involved with the project. And that includes the people at the studios that never take a step on set. In some ways, that's just as challenging as telling a good story. Christopher Lee was so upset at the outcome that he boycotted the premiere of Return of the King. He and Jackson didn't speak for a number of years, Jackson even admitting that he knew that Lee was very upset. However, eventually the two men would come back together, and they did, nearly a decade later. Peter Jackson was helming an expanded version of The Hobbit, which was being fleshed out into a full trilogy of films, which, is a whole different can of worms about why we tell stories concisely. Jackson invited Lee back into the fold, offering him an opportunity to reprise his role. Lee accepted and appeared in the film as the iconic magician. Eventually, Jackson did say that he talked to Christopher about coming to the premiere, and he said, "Am I still in the movie?" And this time I could say yes. The Lord of the Rings was a Herculean effort by all counts. The films took nearly a decade of Peter Jackson's life, thousands of people, and a combined $300 million. And to be fair to everyone involved, the one complaint lodged towards the Lord of the Rings theatrical cuts is that they were a little bloated, which is ironic given a lot of fans now love the extended cuts even more, which are 3.5 to 4 hours long. Studios just don't expect the average moviegoer to go see a 3-hour movie. There are exceptions to this rule, but The Lord of the Rings was a risk to begin with, financially, for the people in suits. Thankfully, Jackson and Lee were amicable and reunited their friendship after some time, but this is never an easy situation to deal with, to be sure. But it's one that many creative people find themselves in, and it's one that every creative person needs to look inside and prepare for, because if you're attempting to produce work on any scale, let alone $1 billion in a decade of your life, this will happen. And the other thing you can do is try to be respectful to all parties and do what's right for the work. Understand your vision and compromise as long as your vision remains what you see. Be true to what you believe in, maybe not true to extended cut DVD sales, but listen along the way. Other people are smart, they have good ideas. Vision isn't narrow when you work with people you respect, and that vision will become the collaborative part of the process.
Back off, Fang Face! The good guys are here! Get off our planet!
Because we're the Power Rangers! And we're not backing down! Yeah!
This is one of the most lasting entertainment franchises of all time. The Mighty Morphin Power Rangers exploded into the 90s with Megazord-like force, and since then has become a key element in our cultural zeitgeist. Over the last 28 years, fans of the Power Rangers have been treated to 3 feature films, over 60 comic books, and over 900 episodes of spin kicks and giant robots with no signs of slowing down at any time in the near future. Despite almost 3 decades of success, the Power Rangers got off to kind of a rocky start. If you remember correctly, 3 of the original cast members in the show's first season were replaced before the second season started filming. Austin St. John, Twee Trang, and Walter Emmanuel Jones, aka the original Red, Yellow, and Black Power Rangers. And what happened there is a lesson in not only knowing your value to a project, but also taking action in order to get what you feel like you're worth. The first season of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers was a colossal success. This is huge for a television show and often huge for all the actors involved. Success means more. More episodes, more work, more fans, and usually more money. Oftentimes, when a show or a film is successful, the actors involved are able to negotiate higher salaries to continue their work. A good example of this is Robert Downey Jr. in Iron Man. He was paid a mere $500,000 to star in Iron Man 1. After the film's success, Robert Downey Jr. was able to then negotiate a higher salary, and by the time he was filming Infinity War, he was estimated to have made about $75 million for the film. With the success of Power Rangers, it would only seem reasonable that the cast was paid a fair wage based on the show's overnight success, right? Sadly, that was not the case. To understand this better, we'll need to take a look at the differences between union and non-union productions. The primary actors union for film and television is called the Screen Actors Guild, or SAG. Rather than make an attempt to fully explain union and labor laws, we're going to kind of gloss over some key details about the Screen Actors Guild. Working on a union project comes with a lot of benefits. First off, there are mandatory minimum wages. Actors are paid overtime if a production lasts longer than 10 hours in a day. They are entitled to benefits, and there are even bonus structures in place for working with hazards like fire or explosives, working with smoke, or even if performers are required to get wet, among others. There are a lot of bells and whistles that come from a SAG contract, but the point here is that a union like SAG ensures that performers are protected from exploitative working conditions and compensated fairly for their time.
I hurt my leg.
No, you didn't.
Yes, I did. I didn't even walk on it at all.
No way, you're lying.
I'm not lying.
Tell me.
Mighty Morphin Power Rangers was a non-union production, meaning that nobody working on the show was ever part of the Screen Actors Guild. There are no guidelines for paying or protecting performers or crew in a non-union project. The pay could be $50 per day, or even nothing at all. Some non-union projects even cite exposure as the pay, as if actors could pay their bills with exposure. The bottom line here is that by switching production to non-union status, the production company behind Power Rangers, Saban Entertainment, was able to circumvent some of the most costly aspects of making a television show, namely, paying their performers. The cast of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers were paid $600 per week. Given that shoots would often run long and were physically demanding, this wage is almost criminally low. Saban took even further advantage of that non-union status and didn't offer any royalties for episodes in syndication for any members of the cast. The actors that were hired were all pretty new to the film television business. Austin St. John was a martial arts student and still in high school when he got cast. Thuy Trang was a 20-year-old student of Shaolin Kung Fu entering her first role. Amy Jo Johnson, who played Kimberly, the Pink Ranger, landed the role 1 month into her foray into acting. Blue Ranger David Yost was cast after only auditioning for 3 months. The point here is that these performers were inexperienced, young actors being offered a role in a television show for the first time. It's doubtful that they were thinking about the subtle nuances of contract negotiations when they accepted. As we stated earlier, the first season of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers was a huge success. The actors were very aware of the show's exploding popularity, and as they watched the flood of merchandise sales grow to an overwhelming degree,
This is totally terrific!
they grew frustrated that they still were making $600 per week. According to some of the cast members, there may have been an attempt to get the principal ensemble to push Saban Entertainment into creating a union production, but those talks fell through. After that happened, Austin St. John, Thuy Trang, and Walter Manuel Jones stopped showing up to voiceover sessions in protest over their low wages. There were threats of leaving, and this battle of attrition went about as far as it could possibly go. There's that age-old saying, the squeaky wheel gets the most grease. Well, sometimes if the wheel is too squeaky, it gets replaced entirely. That's what happened to these 3 performers. Austin St. John was fired and replaced with the new Red Ranger, Rocky, played by Steve Cardenas. Walter Emmanuel Jones was replaced with Johnny Young Bosch as the new Black Ranger, Adam Park. And Thuy Trang was replaced with Karen Ashley, the new Yellow Ranger, Aisha.
I present to you the new Power Rangers. We will now start the ceremony to transfer power from Jason, Zach, and Trini to Rocky, Adam, and Aisha.
Just like that, it was over. And the message was sent to the rest of the cast that you can and will be replaced if necessary. After all, these characters spent over half of every episode inside of a dinosaur helmet that disguised their identity, so the rationale was likely that it didn't really matter who was in the suit. A few of the other cast members dropped off pretty quickly after those 3 got fired. Amy Jo Johnson left the show in the middle of season 2 due to safety concerns. She was almost set on fire during the production of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie, and was electrocuted during the filming of 1997's Turbo, a Power Rangers movie. Things that likely wouldn't have happened on a union project. David Yost hung in there until Power Rangers Zeo, despite being bullied on set due to his sexuality. But that's for a whole separate episode. Since then, there have been over 20 different actors to play every different Power Ranger. In fact, the swapping of cast members has become an expected part of the Power Rangers universe. They took the initial firing of those first 3 Power Rangers and effectively made it into a canonical element of the show.
Zordon, what are we gonna do without a Pink Ranger?
There is somebody out there that can take my place.
Hi, everyone.
The power's all yours now.
It continues to serve the show well in terms of keeping things fresh and also eliminates any leverage that a cast member might be able to use against the production company. In 2018, after Hasbro acquired Power Rangers from Saban, it was announced that the show was moving toward hiring union performers. But still, That's almost 25 years of getting away with dramatically underpaying your performers. It's part of the reason that there is a necessity for agents, managers, and labor unions in the entertainment industry. A lot of this comes down to what is in the writing. Non-union contracts can have tricky language, and in them, performers may sign their rights to overtime away. They may waive their rights to getting paid for rehearsals and not even know it. Whatever the case may be, your personal value isn't determined by a contract, or a membership to a fancy union, or anything like that. Your personal value is determined by you and you alone. In the case of the Power Rangers, these performers felt like they were worth more than $600 per week, made a stand, and ultimately were cut loose. But just because they were fired doesn't diminish their value. Despite getting replaced on the show, Austin St. John and Walter Emmanuel Jones are still making appearances at conventions across the nation. Amy Jo Johnson has found success as a filmmaker. She successfully crowdfunded her first feature film, The Space Between, in 2017. David Yost started his own clothing company back in Texas. Heck, even the voice of Alpha, Richard Horvitz, has gone to become a voiceover legend as the voice of Zim in Nickelodeon's Invader Zim. In an industry that is constantly taking advantage of its performers, sometimes the only person you can really trust is yourself.
This is Eric Stoltz. He plays Marty McFly in the hit film trilogy Back to the Future. He went on to become one of Hollywood's biggest stars, dominating the decade and the next with huge blockbuster movies and massive TV roles. He is now today an American treasure. Now, if you had a DeLorean today, you could trace your way back to a time where that reality was slowly coalescing. It existed. The time where Back to the Future was a very different movie, and this guy, Michael J. Fox, was just another kid on a TV show. A time when Crispin Glover didn't just star in one Back to the Future movie, he starred in all three. A time where he didn't end up suing and winning against the very studio that gave him the role. This is the story of just how close we got to those realities. The story of what went wrong with Marty McFly and what really went wrong with George McFly and the actor that played him.
You were wrong. Without just cause or provocation, you denied me permission to do something I have every right in the world to do.
Back to the Future was the brainchild of Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, with some eventual help from Steven Spielberg. But it was not an idea the world loved right away. In fact, almost every studio the two took the idea to absolutely hated it. The script was passed on over 40 times before finally getting made. Some thought the movie was too immature for mass audiences. Others, like Disney, thought the movie was too inappropriate because, this is his mom. But when it was finally picked up by Universal, two people were cast as the leads. Crispin Glover as Marty's dad, George McFly, and Eric Stoltz as Marty McFly. And filming would finally get underway. You've probably heard of method acting. It's a form of acting where you essentially eat, sleep, and breathe the character. On and off set, you become that person. You're always acting. It's intense, but the people who practice it swear by it. It's what led to performances like this. Well, Eric Stoltz, prior to Back to the Future, was known as a dramatic method actor. He took on serious dramatic roles and treated the jobs and characters equally as seriously. Which sounds great. What could possibly make for a better Marty McFly than a guy who envelops everything about him every second of every day? Well, apparently a lot of things could have been better. Back to the Future shot for 6 weeks with Eric Stoltz as Marty. The movie itself would only take about 13 weeks to shoot in its final form, so this was a long stretch, half the length of a lot of movie shooting times. And at about that 6-week mark, almost everyone on the set of Back to the Future looked around and said the same thing. This isn't working.
And he showed me the first 5 weeks of footage cut together, and he just said, I don't think we're getting the laughs that I was hoping we would get.
See, for Stoltz, he wasn't the first choice. Michael J. Fox was, but he was busy shooting Family Ties at the time and couldn't take the role. But things got so bad that the studio panicked. Stoltz wasn't bad necessarily, but he was treating a hoverboard-riding, guitar-playing class skipper with the same seriousness as De Niro in a gangster movie. Shockingly, everyone quickly realized Eric Stoltz wasn't funny. So unfunny that the studio spent $4 million to replace him. So they went to the execs on Family Ties and begged for Michael J. Fox, and eventually worked out one of the craziest shooting deals you'll ever see. Michael would shoot Family Ties, his show, on weekdays and Back to the Future on weekends. Oh, and every single night of the week. He'd be picked up from set on Family Ties, driven to Universal's lot, he'd film till 4 a.m., be driven home, sometimes literally carried into his bed, and then picked back up, again, literally carried out of his bed by a production assistant into another truck at 6 a.m. to shoot Family Ties the next day. Fox says he got 2 hours of sleep a night on average for 3 months. But things went a bit different for George McFly.
Hey, see you later, Pop. Woo! Come on, time to change that oil.
Crispin Glover wasn't just good as Marty's dad George in the original Back to the Future, he was exceptional. He was funny, energetic, and most importantly, the perfect person to portray a weak, mild-mannered father. His performance in the original film is one of the best in the trilogy, but his character and his role in the franchise is one of the strangest stories in film to this day. First, it starts with what happened in the first film. Glover did not like the original ending. At the end of that film, the characters return to the present wealthier, in a nicer house with nicer cars, nicer clothes, greater success. And Glover thought this reduced the message of Back to the Future to money buys happiness. So he voiced his concern, apparently quite loudly, to both producers and the directors of the film. And come contract time for part 2, well, things went just as poorly. Bob Gale would say that Glover asked for as much money as Michael J. Fox. The studio said no, and Glover threw a fit. Crispin Glover says he asked for as much money as Biff's actor and got half. Glover said no, the studio threw a fit. Regardless, Glover wouldn't return for part 2, but that's actually where the story really gets weird. Like, kind of creepy weird.
Bob Gale.
Yeah, Bob Gale was on.
Yeah, I think I listened to it. And on your show, he lied. He lied about
Did he?
some. Yeah, and you guys automatically believed what he said.
Oh, man,
You may have seen this scene from Back to the Future Part 2. Here, Marty's dad hangs upside down in the doorway because he's hurt his back, and this is apparently how the doctor recommends he'd fix it. Well, that's actually kind of sort of Crispin Glover, who, remember, refused to appear in the movie. Instead of announcing a recasting, Universal decided they'd try to hide Crispin Glover's departure. They casted Jeffrey Wiseman as the new George McFly, a move that even the actors on set weren't happy with. Leah Thompson stayed away from him on set out of loyalty to Glover, and the first words out of Michael J. Fox's mouth upon meeting Wiseman was apparently, quote, "Crispin ain't gonna like this," unquote. And there's a reason for that. The lengths they went to trick moviegoers was strange. The beginning of the first film starts with Crispin Glover as older George McFly. So the studio had to get moldings of George's face to do the makeup and get him in it every single day, George being Glover. But for part 2, they actually took the moldings of Glover's face from part 1 and put the new actor inside a prosthetic made of Glover's face molds, and then spliced in footage of Glover from part 1 to make it look more real. They literally put Crispin Glover's face onto another human being. And then, when that didn't look convincing enough, they decided to write in a back injury and literally hang him upside down in hopes that the audience would have a tougher time telling the difference. Yep, that is why this scene exists. And this is a big deal because the split between Crispin Glover and Bob Gale, Robert Zemeckis, and Universal was not amicable. Crispin Glover held a lot of hate for the studio immediately thereafter and still to this day. He did not sign off or approve of his likeness being used for part 2 as a result. So when he saw part 2 and realized, wait, that's me, he was angry. So angry he decided to risk his place in the industry and sue the studio. A lawsuit, by the way, he won. A landmark decision that would prevent movie studios from ever doing something like that again in the future. Literally changed how the industry operated. While Eric Stoltz just didn't have the comedic chops to cut it as Marty, Crispin Glover was almost rebuilt from the ground up. Back to the Future and Back to the Future, what these movies are great examples of how important it is to identify when things aren't right before it's too late. And well, ironically, that just might be the message of these very movies. Maybe Universal had a DeLorean of their own? Or hey, maybe Crispin Glover was just sick of this.
Hello? Hello? Anybody home?
Trust me.
James Cameron's Aliens is one of the best examples of an action horror film. The electric cast, enrapturing story structure, and an atmospheric dread punctured by rapid bursts of action have propelled the film into being a classic, the likes of which is rarely rivaled. The central relationship between Ripley and Corporal Hicks is also one of the most iconic pairings in genre filmmaking, and yet, the now beloved performance of Michael Biehn almost was never to be.
I'd like to keep this handy for close encounters.
Hicks was almost played by another actor entirely. Ridley Scott's Alien redefined the aesthetics of science fiction on the big screen when it was released in 1979. From its Ron Cobb-designed industrial spaceship interiors to its H.R. Giger-spawned otherworldly alien creatures, the film captured the minds of audiences across the globe. It was a runaway success. However, it took nearly 10 years for the film to generate a sequel. The film Aliens, released in 1986, is the brainchild of cinematic auteur James Cameron. Having just written and directed The Terminator, a cult horror film that took on huge box office gains, all eyes were on Cameron. But how does the man who half-directed Piranha 2 and only had one hit under his belt convince the studio to risk the legacy of a beloved classic space horror film? At this point, it's practically an urban legend. Cameron sold the executives at Fox on the prospect of producing an Alien sequel by attending a meeting, writing the word alien on a whiteboard, then adding an S, and then drawing a line through it to form a $sign. Fox agreed with Cameron's assertion there was money to be made off the nightmarish visuals that Scott and company had created. Cameron pitched something wildly different, a departure sequel that would throw out nearly everything else from the visuals of the first movie. Gone would be the oil derrick employees crossed with deep space blue-collar workers. It would be military personnel chic.
Hey, Vasquez. Have you ever been mistaken for a man?
No. Have you?
Cameron wanted to make the film a romantic military space epic horror film for the ages. Bridge over the River Kwai crossed with Gone with the Wind, with a backdrop of interstellar nightmare fuel. Yes, they'd keep H.R. Giger's terrifying alien design, but for the rest of the film, they take a more is more approach. Why have one alien when you can have hundreds? Cameron pitched a story that would see Ripley working as a consultant, journeying with a platoon of space marines that had discovered a new infestation of these horrifyingly vicious extraterrestrials. Production for Aliens began in September of 1985 at Pinewood Studios in Buckinghamshire, London. The brash young filmmaker, used to working on low-budget genre spaces, clashed with the traditional English crew. Multiple key members of the production staff thought Cameron didn't have enough experience to make the film and so actively worked against him during the shoot. The conflict came to loggerheads when cinematographer Dick Bush insisted that the xenomorph hive should be lit brightly so that the audience could observe the intricacies of the costumes. Cameron wanted a smoky and atmospheric aesthetic to the hive. After shooting for a few days with Bush's lighting choices, Cameron pulled rank and had Bush fired. The mounting pressures seemed to be getting worse and worse by the day, until something almost unthinkable happened. One of the main American actors in the film needed to be sent home immediately.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over.
James Remar had made a name for himself on the large and small screen, turning in brooding performances in films like The Warriors and Cruising. He would eventually go on to be recognizable for roles in Dexter and Django Unchained. However, at this point, Remar looked as though he was poised to break out into a quintessential leading man for the 1980s. For Aliens, Cameron cast him as Hicks, the film's central love interest for Ripley and leader of the Space Marines. Cameron was looking for someone who had a rugged masculinity, the emotional vulnerability to portray Sigourney Weaver's love interest, and the paternal honesty to be the adoptive father for the character Newt, the sole survivor of the base the Space Marines explore. However, this arc towards superstardom was short-lived for Remar, as while they were filming Aliens, it was discovered that he was in the possession of illegal substances. After only a few weeks on the film, this discovery sent Remar's visa, his possibilities of work, and the entire production into tailspin. The production took a solve the problem and don't talk about it with anyone style approach to this unfortunate turn of events. Remar was sent home, and Cameron's Terminator colleague Michael Biehn received a phone call in the middle of the night asking him if he had a working passport. The next thing he knew, he was on a plane to England. He would be the new Hicks. If you watch the finished film, you can see that Hicks's military gear, specifically his flak vest, moves around on him and appears to be 2 sizes too large. This is because the costume was fitted for Remar and the production didn't have the time or money to be able to tailor them to Michael Biehn's body correctly. In 2011, at a convention appearance, actress Cynthia Dale Scott, who played Diedrich in the film, said,
"And we showed up for the day, and we looked at the call sheet, and we're reading, and we're going, Michael Biehn, who's Michael Biehn?" And they said, "He's Hicks."
After being touched down at Heathrow, he and Cameron had an impromptu meeting where they slightly altered the character of Hicks to distinguish him from the character of Kyle Reese, the time-traveling soldier that Biehn had previously embodied for Cameron.
Come with me if you want to live.
These small tweaks ultimately ended up creating the aspects of Hicks's personality that made him such a fan-favorite character. In spite of the recasting, the schedule for Aliens was grueling and did not present many opportunities for reshoots. As such, footage of Remar as Hicks is included in the finished film. The production had already completed filming on the hive assault sequence, much of which was far too expensive to reshoot. Granted, it's from the back and in shadow, so unless you know it's him, you'd never guess. The trinity of Ripley, Hicks, and Newt was so beloved by fans that when the franchise distanced itself from Hicks and Newt in Alien 3, it's arguable that they killed the franchise's viability. Yes, the film is an action horror film, but the human characters, their relationships, and the theme of found family struck a chord with viewers in a way that no one could have imagined. This was in large part due to Michael Biehn's steely yet vulnerable performance. His rendition of Hicks is what made the film function. You instantly believe the connection he has with both Ripley and Newt. They feel like a familial unit almost immediately. Without him, who knows if the film is half as successful? Could James Remar have had an equally iconic turn as Hicks? It's possible. However, the wounded nature of Biehn's performance allows the audience and Ripley to fall in love with him.
It's a locator. Then I can find you anywhere in the complex on this.
Thanks.
Despite the multiple decades in between the film's production and its not inconsiderable critical acclaim, much of the cast has chosen to never speak about Remar's firing. The ultimate lesson of Aliens is that sometimes you have to adapt to your surroundings. You have to take into consideration that things aren't going to go the way you wanted, so you have to evolve. Aliens is now a beloved classic that is one of the most celebrated films produced in the 1980s. It's arguably the best film in the Aliens franchise. It expands the world of the original film, gave the titular villain a name, the Xenomorph, and developed Ripley into one of the most iconic characters in genre history. And yet, with one small piece of the puzzle missing, would it have been the same?
This Aunt Viv and this Aunt Viv are on two very different versions of Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. This moment is one of the most important moments in Fresh Prince's run for that very reason. Will greets Aunt Viv, Jazz makes this comment.
You know, Miss Banks, since you had that baby, there's something different about you.
And then he breaks the fourth wall and looks directly at us to make, well, as if to acknowledge the viewer and say, yep, this is just what it is now, let's move on. What the show obviously didn't address is why there was suddenly a new Aunt Viv. Why one of the most important characters on television at the time was suddenly an entirely different woman played by an entirely different actress. What we didn't know is that Aunt Viv didn't leave, she was kind of fired. And what I think is more interesting is not just how and why she was fired, but how the show changed relatively dramatically after she was. This is the story of the two versions of Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, a split that got the show canceled, and how those two versions of the show came to exist. Now the show itself came back.
I came in on your Aunt Vivian can be quite bossy sometimes.
Oh, well, you didn't hear the part where I said boys. The rest of the statement is completely untrue.
Will Smith had no professional acting experience when NBC decided to build the show around him. He was a rapper, and at the time, nothing more. And Will struggled, and trust me, this is important for the Aunt Viv switch. Will struggled to the point where the network almost fired and recast him after the first few episodes were filmed. And yet, the pilot and in turn the show would quickly become a success, and Will grew as an actor, but that process was slow. Yet things went smoothly on set and behind the scenes for most of the first season, and the show would get renewed. But it was apparently the second season where things really started to go downhill. According to Janet Hubert, it was around this time that she started to become upset with the culture of the show and its cast. She thought that Will and Ribeiro, as well as the rest of the cast, weren't taking their jobs seriously, and that it made it hard for the show to be worth watching, and it made it even harder for her to do her job. And Hubert, much like her character, wasn't going to stay quiet about it. There were reports that during the filming of the second season, she began to verbalize her complaints on set. There are reports that she would yell at Will mid-scene when he made a mistake, and that she approached him directly at one point and confronted him about what she deemed childish behavior on set and about his penchant for joking around and having a good time. But these things would really come to a head for, well, everyone, and the studio in the show's 3rd season.
Wait a minute. Boy, do not test me.
Yes, ma'am.
Will would say later when asked about the situation within the 3rd season of the show, that she, Janet Hubert, as he put it, really wanted the show to be the Aunt Viv show. And it was further reported that Janet Hubert was quoted as saying that she's been acting all her life, and this punk kid comes in and they build a show around him? She didn't understand how that's possible. And that 3rd season would prove to be the end of the line. She'd say that she simply couldn't do her job because of Will's attitude, and Alfonso Ribeiro, Carlton, would say in response that it was Hubert whose outbursts and attitude were creating a miserable work environment for everybody. Hubert resented the fact, and she would admit this, that Will hadn't acted, and was upset that he needed to learn how to do so well throughout the process of the show's filming. And even more, she resented the fact that she wasn't being paid a number that she thought was fair. According to her, NBC offered to renew her contract at a rate that didn't include enough growth in pay over the seasons, and this infuriated her. Now, it's worth pointing out that I personally couldn't find anyone confirming this but Hubert, but according to her, she wanted more. She didn't get it. Her behavior towards the cast, and Will in particular, wasn't creating an environment where anyone wanted to fight to keep her aboard, and so Hubert, the original Aunt Viv, was terminated. What happened next would almost help kill the show altogether, but was also unlike anything we've ever seen on television.
And what is that supposed to mean?
Oh, too many big words.
No, Miss Thing, but I got a couple of small words for you.
Some of the show's most iconic episodes were Janet Hubert, Aunt Viv related. Before her departure, the show used her as a way to establish a strong female presence in the house. She was often the show's vehicle to discuss and explore female dynamic and real issues. We saw episodes like this, where she tries to prove to herself that age is nothing but a number, that she's still got it, and that she's independent. But not only that she's made the right choices in life as a wife and a mother. Or the episode where Will and Carlton fight for African studies in hopes that they get an easy A, and Aunt Viv becomes their teacher and really forces them to process and understand the history of their culture. Or even the mall episode where Viv turns the recording booth into a concert hall. In the first 3 seasons, this character was not just almost always the voice of reason, but she was the primary focus of a lot of the show's plot lines. The show was written with Aunt Viv at the forefront of that writing. Hubert was a phenomenal actress that played Viv as a strong woman that fought for herself and never wanted to be unheard. And this show succeeded. Its highest ratings were in the 3rd season with Janet Hubert as Aunt Viv. But once Hubert was fired, the show's dynamic shifted. Nikki was born and Aunt Viv went from a strong independent woman to a quiet background character for most of the show's ensuing run. Episodes would stop focusing so much on her and would treat her as a lesser character, and the plotlines and the stories that were once written for that character fell mostly to Ashley, who would quickly develop a much larger role in the show's writing. This was a very different Fresh Prince from season 4 on. One that was grounded almost exclusively by Uncle Phil and much less so by Aunt Viv, and one that became much more focused on the kids than it did their parents as a result. And a version of the show that coincided with ratings that simply did not live up to the network's expectations. So much so that the show was actually canceled after Daphne Reed's first season, the 4th season of the show in totality. That was supposed to be it, season 4 and done. The Fresh Prince would end with the season finale, and the network would move on. Yet, the world wanted more. A lot more, actually, and thousands, hundreds of letters and petitions were created and sent to NBC for months after the season 4 cancellation. So many, in fact, that the network decided to renew the show for a 5th season, and eventually a 6th season. Seasons that would continue a ratings decline, and included Daphne Reed as Aunt Viv. It actually got bad enough internally that the season 5 finale was written to potentially be the end of the show, just in case NBC happened to pull the plug once the season had ended. It happened to be renewed for a 6th, and the 6th season's finale was written with the knowledge from everybody internally that this would indeed be the last episode of the show. And it's worth saying that Reed didn't necessarily make the show intrinsically worse. In fact, a lot of my favorite episodes are post-Hubert, but it's undeniable that she was a great Aunt Viv, and it's also undeniable that the world did not respond to Daphne Reed's Aunt Viv nearly as much and nearly as well. And the show was at its best, for the most part, when Hubert played the character. Janet Hubert and Daphne Maxwell Reid tell the tale of 2 princes. But regardless, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is to this day a phenomenal show. It's a slice of the very late 80s and early 90s culture that is still funny and sometimes even remarkably resonant to this day. From season 1 to season 6, it's a show that dealt with things eventually that were much more dramatic and much more serious. The reason, by the way, is that Will himself was inspired by some of the more dramatic episodes of this show and asked the writers himself to create a few more dramatic episodes. And those succeeded as well, and a lot of those episodes are still important pieces of television today. But very few shows in television history can survive recasting a lead character entirely, the way that Fresh Prince did. I mean, could you imagine watching this episode live when it aired? You've been watching The Fresh Prince for 3 seasons. Each week, it's primetime television, and there's no functional mass internet at the time, so one night, you turn on Fresh Prince for the season premiere, and in walks this woman, and she's Aunt Viv, and this is what you see? It's a moment of strange confusion that modern television literally could never replicate.
You know, Miss Banks, since you had that baby, there's something different about you.
Millions of people sitting in their home looking at this face. Yeah, well, I'd imagine that's how every viewer felt sitting at home, too.
Remember this? It's the finale of 2000's X-Men, and Rogue has been captured by Magneto, who wants to exploit her power to turn all humans into mutants. All in all, pretty typical Magneto stuff, and yet the plot, like Eric's machine, is literally revolving around Rogue. So how did we go from that to this silent cameo in Days of Future Past a mere 14 years later? How could a character start off so integral to a franchise and end up being treated like an embarrassing ex not even 4 movies later? This is a two-pronged answer: the comics and movie politics. Despite occupying a large amount of narrative real estate in comics, throughout the 1990s, Rogue's arc ran out of gas. She stopped being one of the go-to story-driven characters. After Chris Claremont was removed from the X-Men in the mid-90s, no one other than Claremont really knew what to do with her. She just kinda coasted into the 2000s on nostalgia for the great highs the character had enjoyed under his tenure as a writer. Because sometimes a franchise's need to get bigger with each installment leads to once essential characters with nowhere to go. You can't keep inviting people to a party and expect every guest to be treated equally. But how could this happen to Rogue, a fan-favorite character and integral member of the X-Men team? How could she end up with less screen time than Mystique? To answer that, we have to go back to the beginning. The year 2000 was an exciting time to be a Marvel fan. The company had narrowly survived a bankruptcy and was seeing a resurgence because of potential movie adaptations. It was 2 years after Blade, which proved that not only could Marvel movies be actually entertaining, but they could also be profitable. And now we were getting to an X-Men movie with Patrick Stewart as Professor X. Fan casting was coming to life. The X-Men were coming to the big screen, and it was looking good. No one was thinking about the comics at this point though, and how they had basically stopped laying creative track for future adaptations. This will come into play later. Claremont, a writer known for his complex depictions of women characters, piloted the X franchise to being the highest-selling comic on the market during his almost 20-year time writing Marvel's Merry Mutants. However, after creative differences, Jim Lee saw him pushed off of the 1992 relaunch of Objectiveless X-Men #1, the highest-selling comic of all time. The line lost focus and drastically dipped in quality. Of course, the movie execs weren't worried about this. They were only concerned with making one good movie. However, the fact that creators like Fabian Nicieza, Scott Lobdell, and Rob Liefeld just didn't have Claremont's story sense, dialogue chops, or intimate knowledge of the intricate plotting required to balance the ever-expanding cast is not only a direct reason why the late 90s X-Men books were so bad, but also why Rogue specifically was sidelined. General audiences were pretty unfamiliar with Jack Kirby's perennially beset upon mutants. Their only major exposure outside of the comic book world was Chaim Saban's X-Men the Animated Series. So the producers were smart to have a character as an entry point. Think Neo in The Matrix. So who did they use to introduce us to the wild world of the uncanny X-Men? Through Rogue, the very character that is going to be pushed aside rapidly. In X-Men, we have a prologue that sets up the world of the mutants and the central conflict between Professor X and Magneto. We meet Marie D'Encanto, aka Rogue. One reason fans could expect big things from the character is that she was being played by Anna Paquin, an actual Oscar winner for her role in The Piano. And after Patrick Stewart and Halle Berry, Paquin was one of the biggest names on the call sheet. An actor of her caliber in the role seemed to indicate big things to come. And in the first movie, the fans' wishes were fulfilled. In the first act of the movie, Rogue accidentally puts her boyfriend into a coma and runs away, bumping into Wolverine. And then they have to go on the run, leading the two of them to meeting the X-Men. The important thing is that the movie wouldn't work without Rogue. It's through her that we are introduced to the world of mutants. We ask the questions we would want to ask, like, how do the X-Men work? She's also a young woman, sympathetic and rightly horrified by her powers, elements that make it easy for the audience to relate with her. And then at the end of the movie, her power-absorbing abilities are central to the plot. For Rogue fans, it was exciting to see that she was a big deal in the movie because of how important she became in the books. Fans had every reason to hope that the sequels would have Rogue level up and get super strength, flight, a snazzy jacket, and a romance with Gambit. Unfortunately, with each movie, Rogue became less and less integral to the story. X2 has her around for some big scenes, but you could remove her from the story entirely, and nothing would change at all. And still no new powers. In X-Men: The Last Stand, she actually takes a cure for her mutant powers, and we have never been further away from the on-screen Rogue that we all expected. And then in Days of Future Past, this. A blink if you miss it moment if there ever was one. And yes, they released a Rogue cut of Days of Future Past that included some additional scenes of her rescue and healing Logan's mind, but none of it felt essential in an already over 2-hour movie. In a featurette on the Rogue Cut disc, producer Hutch Parker explained, "None of us wanted to see that sequence go, but that was the storyline. Because it was so self-contained, it really was its own separate mission, that it actually could be lifted with the least amount of negative impact on anything that came before or after." So even in the Rogue cut of the movie, her presence is pretty pointless. Rogue seemed to be in the sequels out of a sense of obligation. In essence, she really never became Rogue at all. You could blame that partially on the fact that Fox didn't have the rights to the Miss Marvel character. In the comics, Rogue levels up because she absorbs Miss Marvel's powers for herself. It all happened in Avengers Annual issue number 10, when Miss Marvel, aka Carol Danvers, went up against Mystique, who was Rogue's adopted mother. In order to protect Mystique, Rogue saps Carol. Since they couldn't put Miss Marvel in the movies, Rogue had no way to get super strong or the power of flight. This is also to say nothing of the fact that after her golden heyday of being written by Claremont, Rogue struggled to maintain the spotlight. After the romance between her and Gambit was resolved, she was stripped of her powers for a time, which the fans hated. Then she was made the leader of X-Men Legacy, which has a cult following but never really broke out. She also wasn't prominently featured in either Morrison or Quietly's New X-Men, a run specifically targeted at fans of the films of Joss Whedon and John Cassidy's Astonishing X-Men, meant to be a prestige return to form. She just wasn't there for the two defining reboots of the team, which left filmmakers with little to draw from. And then, of course, there's Hugh. Besides copyright issues, there was another elephant in the room that kept Rogue from achieving her full potential in the movies: Hugh Jackman. Although Jackman was a veritable unknown when he was first cast in the movie, his charismatic performance would make him the movie's breakout star, a worldwide superstar, and the face of the franchise. He was a bigger part of the movies and the team than he ever was in the comics. So far, Jackman's still the only member of the original movie to get a solo film. In fact, he got 3, one of which was great, one's okay, and one we don't talk about. So between copyright issues and Wolverine's popularity with audiences, Rogue never stood a chance. But the X-Men movies aren't the only franchise to have forgotten about a cast member. Part of the reason that characters could be forgotten is because each sequel has to be bigger than the one before it, and usually that means adding more cast members. And for every minute of runtime given to a new character that's added, there's that much less time for everyone else. Like the Alien movies, they're merciless to any character that isn't played by Sigourney Weaver or Michael Fassbender, killing off beloved characters like Newt, Reese, and Shaw in between actual movies. These poor souls didn't even get the luxury of being killed on screen. The Star Trek Next Generation movies struggled to focus on anyone that wasn't Picard or Data. In a TV show, there's time to focus from character to character over 20-plus episode seasons, but it's easy for your Geordies or Crushers to get lost in the move to the big screen. So what's the lesson here? Maybe that the very characters that help kick off a franchise can sometimes end up with a sort of Pyrrhic victory. The X-Men movie's success led to sequels, which led to the need for more mutants, and that meant less time for Rogue. Add to that the copyright issues with Miss Marvel that sapped Rogue for any potential growth, and Hugh Jackman's superstardom eclipsing everyone else. The movies, like Rogue herself, kept absorbing more and more star power until something or someone had to give. And that someone was Rogue herself. The Lord of the Rings was a huge gamble for New Line Cinema in 2001. They bet literally hundreds of millions of dollars to adapt not one, but 3 books into a trilogy of movies that would be filmed simultaneously. If these films didn't work, they would ruin the careers of everyone involved. And yet the film almost came out dramatically different because of a very different actor being cast as the now beloved character, Aragorn. The Lord of the Rings, written by J.R.R. Tolkien, was originally published in 1955. The trilogy of books, originally intended to be a single volume, is one of the highest-selling novel series in history. Tolkien's book series was originally set up at Miramax, with Fran Walsh and Peter Jackson's adaptations. However, due to behind-the-scenes frictions and Disney putting a cap on what Miramax could spend per picture, Jackson and Walsh took the project to every other studio in Hollywood looking for someone to fund the epic production. Only one person said yes, Bob Shaye at New Line Cinema. In an unprecedented move, he said he would fund 3 films, all filmed simultaneously. This caused Jackson and Walsh to have to prepare the films and cast the large ensemble of characters quickly but very deliberately. After the parts of Frodo and Gandalf, arguably the most essential casting to get correct was that of Strider, aka Aragorn, aka the once and future king of Gondor. Unlike in the novels, where he's much more of a heroic archetype, Aragorn in the films is a man in emotional hiding. He's someone who, over the course of the 3 films, has an arc. He grows into his ability to accept the crown of the realm of Gondor. The man originally cast as the part was Stuart Townsend. Townsend gained widespread acclaim for his turn in the film about Adam. This put him on the map with the US studios, and before he knew it, he was a star in the making. Jackson wanted him for the role of Aragorn because of his intensity, brooding good looks, and youthful energy. He wanted him to balance out Gandalf's older, more Shakespearean tone. However, New Line Cinema executives were concerned that Townsend appeared too young for the role, that he would not be able to convincingly portray a man grappling with the burden of becoming king. However, Jackson and Walsh were convinced that Townsend was the best actor for the role. They wanted actors who were committed to their parts, who truly inhabited the characters as opposed to big movie stars. The fact that the shooting of the 3 films back-to-back would take 18 months meant that the decisions held a lot of weight. The back and forth between Jackson and New Line went so far as the studio insisting that Townsend do a full screen test before officially being given the part. The screen test was never publicly released. However, it's been said that Townsend was flown to New Zealand, fitted for a costume, and filmed an entire scene as the prancing pony. The only evidence that this ever happened is this photo. Unfortunately, things began to quickly turn sour. As the rest of the cast and crew arrived, rehearsals started and tensions rose. It became clear that Townsend didn't fit in well with the rest of the cast. It didn't seem like he wanted to be there. His attitude worsened with every day that filming grew closer. He did not want to rehearse, he did not want to learn how to ride horses, and did not want to learn any fight choreography. Reputable sources have repeatedly said that his constant refrain during all of this was, "You'll get it on the day." This even led to Sir Ian McKellen pulling him aside and asking him, "Do you even want to be here?" Fool of a took. This conflict between Townsend and the production eventually reached a breaking point. On the second day of filming, while shooting the scene of the hobbits under the tree cowering in fear from the ring wraiths, Jackson turned to his producer and said the fateful words that would alter Stuart Townsend's life forever. "I don't think I can work with Stuart." By this point, the train had left the station. It was too late to switch actors, and yet they had to. Jackson felt there was no other way forward. New Line execs went into a tailspin. They frantically made calls, reaching out to agents and managers, checking actor availability. Ultimately, 3 actors were the final contenders: Jason Patric, Russell Crowe, and Viggo Mortensen. Jason Patric was deemed not a big enough star by the studio. Russell Crowe passed on the opportunity because he had just done Gladiator and didn't want to be typecast in fantasy or period epics. So, it all came down to Viggo Mortensen. Mortensen was an outdoorsman, knew how to ride horses, and was a trained swordsman. He was also familiar with the folklore that The Lord of the Rings was pulled from. He was offered the part and literally days later was on a plane to New Zealand. Lacking any time to prepare, he was thrown into the deep end. He was given chunks of the script to read, but was not allowed to see the whole part due to secrecy surrounding the shoot. This made preparing for the role more difficult. He was also not given any time with the other actors. His first day in New Zealand was literally the first day of shooting, unlike the other actors who had been around for 6 weeks of rehearsals and fight training. In fact, when Sam and Frodo were sitting on the table at the Prancing Pony, and Sam says,
"That fellow's done nothing but stare at you since we arrived,"
there was no Aragorn in the movie. They literally didn't know who was going to play the part. Sam and Frodo were playing to an empty corner of the room. However, it would be later in the same location that Mortensen would embody Strider for the first time. The scene in The Prancing Pony where he talks to Frodo in the side room was the first scene shot with his character. Peter Jackson has even said that he doesn't think Viggo got the character down right. He said he was obviously still discovering him. Thankfully, Mortensen was a quick study. When they shot the fight with the ring wraiths at Weathertop, everything clicked into place. Jackson said he could see it happening in real time. Mortensen was embracing the animalistic nature of Aragorn and fully embodying the character. The now iconic shot of Aragorn swinging the torch into the camera lens was completely improvised by Mortensen. That was the moment that he truly became the King of Gondor to the director and the crew. When the film was released, it became a global phenomenon, as we all know. Townsend, he went on to quickly star in both the Anne Rice adaptation, Queen of the Damned in 2002, and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen in 2003. After those high-profile flameouts, his career has never quite been the same, despite marrying Charlize Theron and appearing in the criminally underrated TV show 13. Stuart Townsend's name has been one that's more or less been lost to obscurity. The lesson here is, when your big shot comes, meet it head on. Townsend appears to have been crippled by ego, nerves, and a combination of overconfidence and self-doubt. He got cast in arguably the biggest film franchise of all time, and if he had just been humble and put in the work and really tried to become a member of the team, he'd have a significantly different career. However, it's hard to know those things when you're in the moment, when you're consumed by pressures and the tension of traveling halfway across the world. There are many stories like Townsend. Hugh Jackman wasn't originally cast as Wolverine. The part went to Dougray Scott, who was injured while filming Mission Impossible 2, and, well, the rest is history.
He said he wanted me.
Things move so quickly in the film business that everything is always in a constant state of flux. There are so many ways that things can go. Some are actively malicious, and some are just happenstance. But the fact that so many now iconic performances came from last-minute substitutions is almost incomprehensible. The most unfortunate part of this whole story for Stuart Townsend is that everything seems to have ended the correct way. Let's face it, Stuart Townsend doesn't look old or grizzled enough to be Aragorn. This was a concern from the start by New Line executives, and they actually had a significant point. In the books, Aragorn is 87 years old. Yes, the people of Middle-earth age slower and have longer lifespans, but are you really going to tell me that you buy Stuart Townsend over the weathered and worldly Viggo Mortensen?
For Frodo.
No, of course not. Mortensen's gravitas and regality was key to making the three-film saga actually work.
What are you doing eating?
Well, it's mainly for survival. But I also enjoy the fruity tastes.
If you don't recognize this face, you probably didn't turn on a TV for a good 10 years or so. You may not know his name is Eric Forman, essentially the main character of That 70s Show. Well, actually, you might be confused. It's the character you probably know. But you might have turned on That 70s Show and not seen this guy's face. It was jarring for a lot of fans when they received the news that the actor who played him, Topher Grace, would not be returning for the show's 8th and final season. So what happened here? Everything in season 7 was set up to have us believe that Eric was all set to become a teacher. So why did he suddenly get written off to Africa and replaced with this weird Randy character?
Paper again, Fatso? I win.
Okay, let me try.
Well, let's take a look at why they fired Eric Forman from That 70s Show, or really what happened in general. Eric Forman is the centerpiece of That 70s Show, and he's often likened to Opie from The Andy Griffith Show. He is, more often than not, the voice of reason amongst the show's cast of colorful characters, the lens through which we view the events of the show. Voice of reason in a comedy show often serves as the voice of the audience. As already mentioned, Eric often says what the audience is thinking, which in turn tethers our perception of what is funny about the show to his reality. Though the show does its best to provide perspectives from all of its characters, it's Eric's POV that we return to with the most frequency. His character effectively serves as a grounding tool for some of the show's weirder, zanier moments. But Eric is easy to relate to. He's the everyman, mostly portrayed as a good-natured person, which is something hopefully you strive to be. He also shows a lot of weakness and vulnerability, which is another element to his character that we as viewers gravitate toward. We care about him. We're upset when he fails, and we're proud of him when he stands up for himself. There's a little Eric Forman in all of us, ideally. In fact, it doesn't make a ton of sense for the show to exist without him at all. And honestly, That 70s Show really had a tough time surviving without its main character. A story you've probably heard time and again, a la The Office. Viewership plummeted after Eric was written off the show, and not even the introduction of this Randy character was capable of saving it. So the question remains, why was this decision made? Well, despite the fired series titling, the decision to leave the show ultimately landed on Topher Grace's own shoulders. To understand what brought him to the difficult decision of leaving the show that kickstarted his career, we'll need to look at what life is like for an actor when they are contractually bound to a television series. Sitcoms are very different than single-camera television shows. They are often shot using a 3-camera setup, which is used because it ultimately cuts down on production time, thanks to the ability to get 3 different shots at once without the need to reset lighting, something that often takes hours to do for each shot. And with all that in mind, well, you can imagine how things go. In order to get the shots that are required to make a television show, it requires a lot of time to choreograph the actor's movements. Blocking, for those who are unaware of the terminology, takes a few rehearsals to get right. This all adds to the time in which the actors need to be on set, so this becomes a give and take. Time saved, time spent. Being contractually bound is such a time-consuming process in general can be pretty stifling for an actor who's trying to break into other projects, as much of their time is spent working on just one show. Just ask Michael J. Fox, who had to be carried out of his bed and onto set for Back to the Future while he was filming Family Ties. Now, it's not to say that Topher Grace was unable to land film roles while working on the show. He secured a minor role in 2003's Mona Lisa Smile, had a major role in 2004's Win a Date with Tad Hamilton, which you probably don't remember. It's just that sometimes passion can outweigh a paycheck. Topher Grace wanted the freedom to pursue the projects that he wanted to pursue freely, and was tired of having to pass on projects due to his obligations to a waning sitcom as he saw it. It's not an uncommon story. Grace was far from the first lead actor to leave a sitcom in pursuit of other projects, and he would not be the last. And sometimes it all works out really well for the actor. Look at Steve Carell leaving The Office, and then almost immediately after receiving an Oscar nom for Foxcatcher. Cal Penn leaving House to work on the Obama administration, and after Fresh Prince went off the air, Will Smith went on to become one of the biggest names in entertainment, ever. But sometimes it doesn't work out quite as well. Suzanne Summers left Three's Company and ended up as the spokesperson for Thigh Master. Topher Grace landed somewhere kind of in between. He isn't cranking out lead role after lead role in Hollywood blockbusters, but he's been able to land some roles that I would call big and work with some incredible directors. He played Eddie Brock or Venom in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3, David Duke in Spike Lee's BlacKkKlansman, and Getty in Christopher Nolan's Interstellar. Sure, he hasn't become some kind of household megastar, but he's at a point in his career that most actors dream of getting to. Financially stable with the ability to pick and choose the projects they want to work on, which was his goal in the first place upon leaving the show. It's not a place many actors are able to get to in their careers. But another big reason for Topher's departure was, in fact, financial stability. He had made a ton of money working on that 70s show. He was making anywhere between $250,000 and $300,000 per episode, and he was on the show for 178 episodes. Needless to say, money was no longer a concern for this blossoming actor. When you begin your career by being set for life, it can really give you a leg up as you progress into other projects. After realizing, though, that they were losing Topher Grace, the showrunners of that 70s show initially had the intent of hiring Mad TV alumni Josh Myers to take over the role of Eric. They even had a line of explanatory dialogue ready in which Eric would say that he returned from Africa a changed man. We've seen stuff like this before. The Fresh Prince Aunt Viv switch did something similar. And they realized it was an objectively terrible idea, so the decision was made to create an entirely new character. Enter Randy. Well, fan response to the character was lukewarm at best, and viewership began to decline rapidly, and understandably so. In real life, when a close friend leaves to better their lives on their own terms, we don't just go off and replace that friend with Seth Meyers' brother. We stay in touch, we talk on the phone, we write letters, and we make plans to visit. This level of normal, understandable, real-world behavior isn't attainable when an actor leaves the show beyond maybe mentioning that he sent a letter or something. When an actor leaves a show, they usually leave for good, and every trace of them that ever existed is usually stripped and replaced in favor of driving new plotlines. When a television show loses its most important character and tries to replace them in a way that feels disingenuous, like they're shoving him or her down their throats, and by their throats I mean the characters, but also ours, we, and I would imagine the characters, should feel almost resentful in a way. It's almost as if the show betrayed the memory of our friend Eric Forman and spent an entire season telling us to just get over it. When I say viewership of the show dropped, it was almost 40% during the show's 8th season, and without much gas left in the tank, it was decided that the show would end its run on May 18, 2006. Topher Grace did, however, return for the show's finale in an uncredited performance. His departure from that 70s show wasn't born from spicy on-set drama, conflict with production staff, or even erratic behavior. It was born from his own desire to follow the career path that he wanted to carve out for himself. Sometimes when actors or artists make decisions like this, we can perceive them to be foolish or selfish for walking away from a successful project or leaving behind their fan base, but success isn't always determined by stability and money. Sometimes you need to go with your gut and pursue the career you want to build for yourself. And sometimes that means getting out of your comfort zone and jumping into something new and exciting. For Topher Grace, he had the financial stability to do that in the way he wanted to do it. He took the risk, he took the jump on his own accord. It's an extremely respectable move, and it seems to be paying off for the guy. After all, his new ABC comedy, Home Economics, was just picked up for a second season. So what did we learn here? You know, follow your dreams. It's cliche, but man, I mean, if you've spent 7 years at a job you don't maybe love that much, or maybe you're jaded by it, maybe it's time for a switch, especially in creative fields. A change of scenery can mean the world, and if you're able to do it, well, just Topher Grace it.